Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This will be Part 8, Chapter 5, entitled, Getting Back Up is the Hardest Part. His head wouldn't stop throbbing, the pain radiating from the back of his head, making his pulse pound in his ears. It had been hours since Tomura had woken up, spread out on the bar floor after being taken out in the USJ raid. Hours. And he still couldn't focus his eyes properly. If that wasn't enough to make his hands twitch, then the fact that they kept saying they didn't know who did it definitely was. "I'm telling you, Sensei, it was the quirkless kid. He ruined everything." He needed something he could tear apart with his quirk, preferably a quirkless runt who destroyed their attack. His stats were all over the place. He shouldn't have even been there, but then he was making a mess of everything. I don't care that All Might eventually showed up. It doesn't mean anything if we couldn't destroy him. And it's all because of that quirkless little shit. His nails were leaving red furrows in his neck, but he couldn't stop, not when the rage boiled so close to his skin and felt like 1,000 burning ants dancing all over him. Of course, he could only use one hand, the other broken one, wrapped up by Kurogiri while he was unconscious. "Why do you hate him so much, Tomura?" The itching got worse. "He ruined our plans, Sensei. We got beaten by some quirkless hack." As soon as he could, he would have his revenge. He would disintegrate each of his limbs until he was nothing but a lump of flesh, and only then would he destroy his throat and those stupidly determined green eyes. "Each of those students were powerful, Tomura. Any of them could have overcome you if it was the quirkless one that posed a problem. You have plenty of time if you do want to kill him. But what is it that has you so riled up about him? You hate him on a deeper level than you do usual obstacles you face." "He broke my arm and knocked me out." Tomura started to pace across the bar. He wasn't meant to raise his voice against Sensei. He shouldn't have done that. But he couldn't escape that quirkless kid's ridiculous plain face with his determined expression. He'd been so sure he'd had a stupid hero hopeful on his hands, but then he turned around and said he didn't think he could be a hero. He'd interrupted Tomura, not only that, but he'd had the fucking audacity to compare him to the heroes, saying they were the same, believed the same things. They weren't. Couldn't be. Tomura hated this twisted self-aggrandizing society and their heroes. He wasn't a part of it. He was going to tear it down with Sensei, and he apparently had the same opinion on quirklessness as everyone else. "Sensei, quirkless people are worthless, right? They can't do anything." His scratching stopped as he stared at the monitor, waiting for the answer. "You said the child who ruined your plans was quirkless. That means he was capable of something. By your logic, that would give him worth." Tomura started pacing again, trying to figure out how someone so worthless could actually be capable of achieving anything. He pictured a villain without a quirk, but still with that determination and the ability to run away from a creature that was meant to kill All Might. The kid had targeted Tomura's quirk as well, breaking his arm and wrist, which showed he wasn't completely idiotic when it came to fighting. He could be a valuable addition to their party. After all, why would he have any loyalty left for the heroes that had mistreated him? But he'd looked at him, even with Tomura holding his neck and having disintegrated part of his arm, and dared to speak to him about fixing things, as if this society wasn't already rotten to its core. Disgusting. No, there was no way that kid could be useful if he thought anything in society was worth saving. He just couldn't shake the pain that had been in the kid's eyes when he'd asked that question. So hurt, but still trying. Stupid. "You will become a symbol for the underworld, Shigaraki Tomura. It will be up to you whether the quirkless are people you destroy or embrace." Tomura narrowed his eyes. He wanted to kill that kid, but he didn't want to be the same as the heroes by rejecting the rest of the quirkless. They may have some hidden abilities. "Yes, Sensei." He wasn't sure what option he'd choose yet, but Sensei had said he had time. Izuku's day started at 1 a.m., an hour after he'd gone to sleep, having finally quieted his thoughts enough to pass out after everything that had happened at the USJ. Deciding that was definitely not enough sleep, he'd gone back to bed only to wake up again at 3 a.m. When he'd woken up at 5 a.m., he didn't bother trying to go back to sleep. He was sick of choking on sludge and all the words he'd left unsaid. He was tired of his new nightmare, where his hands reached for his classmates and disintegrated them in front of his eyes, while he was paralyzed and could only watch. He'd only felt relief when those hands had finally turned to him. even though it had taken so long for them to reach his throat and finally stop his screaming. He was fortunate he'd never been one to cry out in his sleep. He didn't want to worry his mom more. But with those images fresh in his mind, he decided there wouldn't be any going back to sleep despite the exhaustion that still lingered in his limbs like an unwanted guest. Getting out of his bed with all the grace of a dead fish, he managed to make it to his computer and flip to a clean page of his notebook. Last night he hadn't even tried to look into the villains that had attacked them, too caught up in what he'd learned about himself, and then later crying over the concern his friends had shown, as they'd messaged him late into the night. Inko had been so worried, which had made Isuku feel guilty because he hadn't really been in a good state to comfort her. At least Recover Girl had been able to patch him up so he wasn't coming home bleeding everywhere. The white bandage on his arm stood out starkly in the darkened room. He had a few band-aids on his hands and another bandage around his neck, but the rest of his injuries had been minor enough to not need dressing, or they were strains and bruises that he needed to rest. While lying down would probably be best for recovery, he couldn't stay in his bed and do nothing. Sitting at his desk was probably the closest he would get to rest for today. Broken fingernails roamed around his keyboard as he began looking into the League of Villains who had attacked them yesterday. He doubted he'd be able to find any solid information on the ringleaders if they've been completely undetected until now. A notification had been sent out across the Hero Network asking for information on potential leads, but no one had been able to identify the two. The name Kurogiri had brought up no leads, and they'd never learned the name of the villain covered in hands, who had since been nicknamed Decay by the heroes involved with the case. Still, he went looking. Even if he couldn't find out who they were, he might be able to find out how they recruited people and stop them from taking advantage of those same methods in the future. In that same time, he managed to reply to the latest email from Stain that had been sitting in his inbox, and with a bit of contemplation asked if he knew anything about the villains that had appeared in the USJ. Along with a solid breakdown of why you can't kill imperfect heroes because no hero was perfect, even All Might. He knew it was showing his hand a bit since he had included a description of the two leaders, even though there hadn't been an official release with the villains' details yet, but he'd already proven he had a specialization in working with information, so it was a calculated risk. Stain still didn't trust him by any means, but Isuku was making progress when it came to adjusting his mindset and ideology. It was 7 a.m. by the time he'd heard Inko get up, shortly after which she appeared at his doorway, asking if he wanted anything in particular for breakfast. He'd just given her his best smile and told her whatever she was making would be wonderful. He'd managed to find a bit of talk about recruitment from some of the low-leveled villains that had been at the USJ, but little else. If he was honest with himself, he almost didn't want to find anything. He was still tired, still trying to cope with everything. It wasn't every day. You realize you'd given up your lifelong dream without realizing, only holding on to it because it was one of the only things you had left. It left him feeling small and fragile, unsure of what the next step was. So he got up, wincing at the protest his recovering muscles made, and made his way to the kitchen to help his mom make breakfast, leaving a few tabs open to return to on self-help, and his notebook open to his notes on the Heroics Commission. Just because he wasn't sure what the next step was, didn't mean he wasn't going to take it. The punching bag swung as Katsuki landed another hit, sweat rolling down his back as he worked through his emotions. Fucking bullshit. He didn't need to work through any emotions, he just needed to be better, faster, stronger. The misfucker had managed to get a portal underneath his feet and sent him into the fire zone. Clearly he hadn't known about anyone's quirk because Candy Cane's barrier had cooled down the air and reduced Katsuki's body temperature, slowing down his sweat production. But the fire zone? That was perfect for getting the most out of his quirk. He'd blasted away all the low-level grunts they'd come across, and he'd gotten out with barely a mark, along with soy sauce and shitty hair. It had been easy. It had been quick. They'd even met a bunch of pros worried about nothing halfway back to the entry, all the plaza villains taken care of. And somehow, Deku had done that for longer with no help. Weak, useless, pathetic, worthless Deku, who'd weaseled his way into the hero course, who'd done well, got out by himself and with no quirk. Deku, who apparently didn't believe he could be a hero but had never stopped fucking trying, no matter what was said or done to him. Everyone had heard his cut-off scream and had seen his bloody arm. They'd waited in silence before he'd given out the number of heroes he'd asked. He'd always known Deku was a fanboy. Anyone who was around him for more than a day could tell you that, but asking 237 heroes was beyond that. It was desperate, a sign of weakness, Someone worthless looking for praise, and he didn't even have the conviction to think that he would find it. Katsuki grunted, laying a series of rapid punches into the bag. He just couldn't figure out why Deku hadn't given up. Did he seriously have nothing else outside of running around and annoying heroes? He knew the nerd didn't have any friends. Anyone who didn't find him an annoying waste of space didn't want to be associated with the quirkless freak. That was the same reason he'd never joined any clubs. He still remembered running into the nerd after he'd tried talking to their teacher at the start of middle school about not being allowed to join clubs, crying like a baby because they told him to suck it up or figure it out. It wasn't their job to deal with his quirkless ass. It was pathetic. Even if he didn't have anyone at school, and only had his mom at home. If he wanted to be a hero so bad, he should have worked harder and stopped being such a crybaby over everything. His next punch was powered by a small explosion, which happened to be loud enough for his mom to hear down the hall. "Bakugo Katsuki, no quirk use in the house. We're not replacing any of your training equipment if you fuck it up." "Shut up, hag, I'm not doing anything." She kept yelling back something about not talking to his mom that way, but he tuned it out. He just wished his thoughts would shut up as well, instead of thinking about Deku. He'd wanted to figure out what was up with him, but it had taken a back seat after Deku decided to throw himself out of the windows of their middle school classroom. Katsuki had answers now. The disappearing act had all been a part of finding heroes to ask his dumb question to. So why couldn't he stop thinking about it? Maybe it was because he had been waiting for the nerd to turn around and join the villains at the USJ, admitting that they'd tricked UA together to get Deku into the school. It would have made sense with how silent and empty Deku had gotten. Instead, he'd gotten his arm fucking disintegrated and then ran off instead of fighting back. With a shout, the punching bag was sent flying off its hook, crashing into the floor. "Katsuki! Fuck off!" It didn't matter. Deku was still quirkless. Even if he'd somehow gotten into UA, was close enough behind him in the entrance exam, didn't get expelled in the quirk assessment test, and was the first one in their class to face a villain. He didn't think about Deku admitting to being almost killed by the sludge villain the same day as him. That didn't count. It didn't. Deku was still beneath him. Katsuki was going to make sure he was the best in their class, better than any villain, and he would be the #1 hero. He didn't have time to waste, thinking about a worthless Deku. No one had known how to talk about the attack when class returned the next day. Several of his classmates had crowded him at his desk that morning, asking if he was okay since he looked like shit. The comment courtesy of Jiro, but she hadn't been cruel about it. He did look pretty awful, with dark circles and bruises and scrapes still spread over his skin. They all danced around mentioning what he'd said at the USJ, none of them asking why he did what he did, whether or not he was broken. It was nice to have the positive attention, if somewhat overwhelming. He was pretty sure they weren't pretending. They didn't have the right tone for that, and none of them were trying to offer him anything to trick him into owing them something in return. Ashido had asked to see his arm after he'd mentioned it would scar, but she hadn't been too pushy about it, especially after Ida had started to lecture her about proper conduct. Kirishima had taken the distraction to tell Isuku that he thought scars were pretty manly, and Isuku hadn't really had a response for that. They'd finally been dispersed by Bakugo, who'd also been crowded since his desk was right in front of Izuku's with a series of small explosions. "So what? Quirkless nerd got caught before the fight even started. What the fuck are you fawning over? That isn't cool. That's being a liability." Izuku felt his mood drop at Bakugo's words, even though some of their other classmates talked back to him. He just kept telling himself that he got himself out, so it was fine. He wasn't a burden, and Aizawa had said that he shouldn't have had to get himself out anyway. Think about that later. He didn't need to get caught up in those thoughts at school, and definitely not at the start of the day. But he did watch Bakugo as he shouted back at their classmates, aggressively leaned forward, teeth bared. Bakugo had been his best friend, and his worst bully. Aizawa had said he hadn't deserved the treatment he'd gotten, but no one had ever called Bakugo out, or told him he was wrong. It had been one of the constants of his childhood. Bakugo was always the best, always right, and far above a Deku, who couldn't do anything. Yet ever since he'd joined UA, that had started to change. He was saved from having to consider it further by Aizawa walking into the classroom, which sent the students running to their seats. "Right. I hope you all haven't gotten too comfortable with your day off, because you've got a new storm approaching." The tension in the room immediately spiked, several pairs of eyes darting around looking for a threat. UA's sports festival is only 2 weeks away. There was a beat, then. "Sensei, you can't phrase it like that." "I was worried we had more villains coming." Ojiro still looked ill at ease, the tip of his tail twitching back and forth. "Yeah, can we still have the sports festival even after being attacked?" Aizawa surveyed the room, starting at the back and ending on Hagakure, who had asked the question. I was opposed to it, but it's necessary to demonstrate that UA's crisis management protocols are sound. It also boosts morale and shows that we weren't strongly affected by the attack. There will be 5 times the police presence. It's also a national event, so it's not easily cancelled. He paused for a moment, making sure that everyone was paying attention despite the classroom staying silent. This festival is the greatest opportunity you'll get to show off your skills. Pro heroes and their agencies scout for interns through the sports festival, and companies will look for collaborators and people to sponsor. You can even begin building up your public image this way. Kaminari snapped his fingers. Oh yeah! Pros pick up sidekicks straight out of UA if they do well. Yeah, and some of them stay stuck as sidekicks forever. Jiro leaned forward. That'll be you, Kaminari. Hey! The blonde stopped rocking back on his chair so he could shoot Jiro a glare. As the excitement started to build for the sports festival, so did the noise in the room. Just as they were about to reach the point of needing to shout to be heard, Aizawa's eyes flashed red, and his hair raised, making everyone silence themselves immediately. Like I said, this is an important opportunity for you all, even in your first year. Make sure you put in a good effort, even if you're not going to be scouted for sidekicks yet. It can still have a lasting effect on your career if you're noticed now. Isuku had spent a lot of his life trying not to be noticed, but the way Aizawa phrased that made it seem like more than posturing and vying for popularity. He kept turning the information over in his head as Aizawa gave a run-through of how the sports festival worked for the students. They had only ever been spectators before now, but now they would be a part of the festival. It didn't feel real. Aizawa was finishing up his explanation when Isuku finally figured it out. UA was one of the most highly regarded heroics programs for multiple reasons, one of those being the real-life experience the students received through work experience weeks and internship opportunities. It would make sense if the work experience came after the sports festival, when agencies had a chance to look at the students' performance before they agreed to take on any of them. There would have to be some sort of backup system for the students who didn't get offers, but Isuku had no idea what it would be and whether or not they would accept him. Agreeing to take on a heroic student who may or may not have had the best showing at the sports festival was one thing. Taking on someone quirkless was something else entirely. No matter how well he performed in the festival, no one would want him. They might have to take him on, but Isuku didn't want that. He knew from years of group projects that forcing him into a group with people who didn't want him just meant more work, more pain, and gaining nothing from the experience. He made a mental note to start researching the agencies that would have an agreement with UA to take on students who didn't get offers, and agencies who actually might be able to teach Isuku something. He needed to make sure he didn't fall behind, and if he needed to convince an entire agency to take him on, then he would do it. The rest of the day passed fairly quickly, helped along by Izuku's exhaustion, which made every blink feel like minutes had passed. He'd slept badly, and Recovery Girl had fixed up the rest of his scrapes during lunch, so he was looking forward to going home and sleeping after starting his research. However, he still had a meeting with Nezu to get through before he could get home. Uraraka and Ida had joined Isuku and Shinso, where they were packing up their desks for a quick chat before they split up for the afternoon, when someone opened the door to the classroom, and a wall of chattering and shuffling noises made its way into the room. What's going on? Ojiro took a step back from the door, giving the 4 of them a good view of the crowd that was gathered outside of the classroom doors. Scouting the competition, obviously. We're the kids that survived a villain attack, so we're going to be the biggest threat at the festival. Bakugo shouldered past Ojiro, sneering at the other students. No point, though. Move aside, cannon fodder. Izuku rolled his eyes internally, getting up from his desk, while Ida berated Bakugo from beside him. Can you please not resort to calling those we don't know cannon fodder? Get the hell out of my way! Bakugo ignored Ida, choosing instead to start pushing his way through the crowd. I'm headed for the top. Just give up to save yourself the effort. Wow, the hero class sure is modest. 2 of the students pushed their way to the front of the crowd, one with dark hair and crossed arms, the other with some sort of scaled hands mutation made obvious with the way he slung his arm over the first boy's shoulders. Honestly, I thought it sucked that we were stuck in general, but maybe we'll skip joining the hero course if this is what they're all like. Or is that just what happens when you're so cool and survive a villain attack? The mocking tone was clear in the scaled boy's voice, dismissive and angry at the same time. Several of Izuku's classmates froze at the statement, sending worried glances back at him. Izuku just stayed where he was, now near the doorway, watching the exchange. He'd heard far worse and far more awful situations. Mocking him for surviving wasn't going to get a reaction from him. Hey, I'm from Class 1B next door. The shout distracted everyone, drawing their attention to a silver-haired boy who was waving his arms and shouting to be noticed above the rest of the crowd. "I heard you guys fought some villains and wanted to know more. But all I'm seeing is this arrogant bastard. Better not make fools of the hero course at the sports festival." By now, everyone in 1A was starting to look for alternate ways to leave the room so they wouldn't have to deal with the crowd, though no one looked desperate enough to go for the window or the vents yet. The dark-haired boy rolled his eyes. "Hey, was it your class or the other one that was meant to have a quirkless kid? If so, that's a guaranteed spot, right?" "That is uncalled for." Ida was now in front of the crowd, arms moving robotically as he spoke. He looked put off by Ida's strong response, eyebrows raised and his mouth twisted in a frown. "What? It's totally a backwards idea." "Like seriously, be realistic," his scaled friend spoke up from beside him. "They're useless. What are they going to do as a hero, bore villains into surrendering?" Isuku knew that one of his classmates would speak up, and could see several opening their mouths to respond, but he wanted to know something before they tried to say anything. "Why?" Isuku was in front of Ida and the rest of the class now, directly across from the two general education students. They turned and looked towards each other briefly before the scaled boy responded. "Why what?" "Why can't someone quirkless be a hero?" Isuku could tell the other members of 1A were staring at him, but he ignored them and whatever they thought about his question. He kept his attention on the two students in front of him, refusing to back down even as the crowd muttered. "Look, it's impossible." The dark-haired boy leaned forward into Izuku's space, making a show of looking him up and down. "What's up with you that you can't see it?" The scaled boy laughed. "Yeah, honestly, if I was quirkless, I'd prefer to kill myself." Distantly, Izuku could hear protests coming from his classmates, but the words at the front of his mind were far older, spoken dismissively. "If you want to be a hero so bad, I have a shortcut for you. Take a leap of faith off the school roof and hope for a quirk in your next life." He hadn't paid the comment much attention. Wasn't as if it was the first time he'd been suicide-baited, but hearing the same sentiment at UA flicked some sort of switch inside of him. "Most of them do." "Huh?" The two students peered down at him, still so sure of themselves. Izuku stared right back at them. "Most of them do. Only half the quirkless population make it to their 40s, and half of those deaths are self-inflicted. A quarter of a whole demographic kill themselves because they have no job prospects, no support from community or the government, face social ostracization, and they're often victims of hate crimes and human trafficking, even if they survive themselves." All the students aside from the ones at the fringes who couldn't hear what was going on had gone silent. For once, others would know what he'd learnt in his first year of middle school. "You didn't know that, did you? You also probably didn't know that those studies were done 2 decades ago, and that in that time, the rate of quirklessness has dropped significantly, meaning discrimination is at an all-time high." Izuku took a deep breath, letting the bitterness and anger that lived tucked away within him color his tone. "Not one person who has ever told me to be realistic actually knows what it means to face reality. I've survived this long because I got very good at ignoring reality and fighting for every tiny thing I have." He looked both boys in the eyes, chin up and defiant, instincts honed over a decade of bullying telling him to stop before he made them more mad, but his anger kept him in place. "If you want my place, you're going to have to pry it from my cold, dead, quirkless hands." With that declaration, he walked around them, weaving through the crowd in a way that was second nature. He couldn't bring himself to care that all those kids now knew he was quirkless. They'd have found out eventually, and he could handle whatever they chose to throw at him when he had 1A, his home class, the first one who had ever treated him well, to return to. By the time he reached Nezu's office, he'd managed to calm down, putting his anger away and letting his fatigue dull what was left over. This time he didn't try to repress it, after learning recently that wasn't a healthy thing to do, but he couldn't talk to the principal if he was in that state, so he let it pass. He knocked on the door, a quick pattern Nezu had given him so he could always be identified by Nezu before he entered the room, before gently opening it. An apology for being late, even if only by a few minutes, was on his tongue, only to quieten when he recognized the room had other occupants. "Ah, Midoriya. Well, it's wonderful to see you out and about. I'm afraid there must have been some miscommunication. Our lesson today has been cancelled. However, I believe we can hold it tomorrow if you're available." Nezu tilted his head inquisitively from where he sat at his desk, but Izuku's eyes were still on the other occupants. More specifically, the tall, blonde figure that he recognized in one of the chairs sat across from Nezu, and had now turned to look at him with electric blue eyes. Izuku nodded absent-mindedly, focus split between All Might and Nezu, though he noted there was a plain, black-haired man in the chair beside All Might. I believe this is a fault on my part. So much has happened recently it slipped my mind to tell you, as I'd already assumed you'd want to postpone the lesson. The mammal chuckled warmly. I'm glad that this attack hasn't left you unwilling to continue learning. Of course I still want to learn. Izuku flashed Nezu a small smile before averting his eyes, doing his best to ignore the feeling of All Might's eyes still staring holes into him. Sorry for interrupting. I'll see you tomorrow. Wait, Midoriya, before you go, I was hoping to speak to you. Isuku paused, the twisting feeling in his gut getting worse as he met All Might's sunken eyes. I can't. The hero's eyebrows drew together. You said that last time, and I'm afraid I still don't understand. If now's not a good time for you, then perhaps later in the afternoon. I can't. Izuku's eyes were glued to the floor, hands clenched into fists by his sides. He hadn't meant to say it so forcefully, to interrupt All Might, but he needed him to stop trying to find some way to talk. Why? It was almost funny how he'd only asked that same question a few minutes beforehand and was now facing it himself. One simple question, and it brought forward every positive and negative thought he'd ever had on the hero in front of him. There was no simple way to describe how All Might made him feel, but he took a deep breath and tried his best to articulate it, the very least why he couldn't confront the man. I don't know whether I should thank you or condemn you. Every time I see you, all I can think about is you telling me that I can't be a hero, to be realistic. But that was also what set me on the path that got me into UA. Seeing you in class is already hard. I can't properly talk to you. I'm just waiting for a time that I can actually listen to you and not hear the past before we talk. I'm sorry, All Might. And with that he left, not waiting further response as he closed the door and continued down the hallway. He should be better around All Might. He'd even listened to Izuku's advice at the USJ, though he'd needed to yell to be heard and scream to be listened to. But still the hero haunted Izuku. He was still the first hero that had crushed his dreams, and it still hurt, even a year and so many more rejections later. Izuku left the UA building, and mentally noted yet another thing he had to work on. Now Masa looked between the door and a dejected-looking Toshinori. He called you All Might. The statement broke the silence of the room. Yes? None of my students know my name. Toshinori blinked at him, not seeming to understand the implications. None of the students should be able to recognize you in this form, either. Toshinori finally seemed to get what he was saying, blustering as usual when he had an answer, but didn't know how to articulate it. That wasn't an unusual occurrence, but for someone to recognize him in this form, and to not want to speak with the number one hero definitely was. None of what the child had set off Namasa's quirk either, which was worrying given the implications within his statement. Ah, right. Toshinori finally stopped giving half-statements, though he still seemed uneasy, a hand running through his perpetually messy hair. Now Masa sent a quick glance to Nezu, but the mammal didn't seem to have a better understanding of what was going on, considering he was leaning forward slightly, waiting for more information. What they got was something that neither could have expected. It was a story of a villain chase, fairly standard all things considered, but at the end of his time limit. Of a quirkless boy, who'd had a question so desperate he'd hung on to the hero's leg and gone flying across the city with him. Of a question answered, and a time limit and injury revealed. Of another attack from the same villain, and heroic potential. You didn't think to tell me this so I could help you follow it up. Now Masa ran a hand over his face, massaging the bridge of his nose to try and stop the headache he could feel building. Toshinori, for his part, at least looked a bit sheepish. I didn't think it would come up again, so I didn't want to add something so trivial to your workload. You are incredibly lucky it didn't come up again. Nezu's voice was cold as he cut in, before Masa could remind the hero again that it was part of his job and he didn't mind. Toshinori, there are multiple paths Midoriya could have taken after that afternoon, and you should be very glad that none of them involved hatred. If that boy had chosen to get back at the world for all the hatred he's been shown, and did so by focusing it on you, you would be dead by now. Now Masa froze and saw Toshinori do the same in his periphery. There was no lie in Nezu's statement, but it didn't seem to fit the small, freckled child Masa had just seen minutes ago. That seems like a pretty extreme outcome. No, it isn't. Nezu once again directed his attention away from him and to Toshinori. You trusted a child whose dreams you just destroyed to not expose a potentially life-threatening secret that would be an easy way to hurt you in return. You had no idea what this boy has gone through, what else he could have been dealing with aside from the standard form of abuse that quirkless individuals face, though it sounds like you didn't consider that either. Exposing your secret is the least he could have done in retaliation, literally. He shifted at his desk, tapping along the edge of it with his paw. I've been working with Midoriya after school to help him develop his analytical skills, and have read what I believe is just over half of his notebooks on heroes. If he had really wanted to, he could have personally killed you, along with many other heroes. The silence was only broken by Nezu's tapping, and a wet cough from Toshinori. Naomasa wasn't naive. He knew heroes weren't as invincible as the media made them out to be. He also knew that it was far more common for them to die outside of villain fights from age, injury, or sickness. Murders and assassinations also weren't uncommon, if the statistics were compared to the average citizen's likelihood of being murdered, but they were still rare and always caused a big stir within the hero and police communities. So to hear that a high school student could be responsible for multiple deaths was definitely something to investigate. How? Nezu gave him a pleasant smile at the question, which never boded well in these serious conversations. Well, exposing his secret is an easy way to get villains to do the work for him. But given his skill with pattern analysis, tracking, and a sling, he could have just waited for Toshinori to walk by and killed him with a rock to the head. That, or finding his address and slitting his throat in his sleep would be the simplest way to go about it. Of course, he could also use some sort of poison, procure a gun and use that, hire a hitman, lay an elaborate series of traps meant to slowly weaken Toshinori as he works his way through them, or dozens of other methods. He has an incredibly wide variety of skills and the determination to hone them to near perfection. Ice crawled down Naomasa's back at the list, and it only got worse when the mammal's pleasant expression turned to Toshinori. You are incredibly lucky, and I think it would be best if you give Midoriya the space he has requested at this point in time. Toshinori could only nod in the face of the revelation, while Naomasa wondered just exactly what he'd stumbled into now. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 5. Second half to Chapter 5 will be up next. I like this chapter a lot. I think the author does a really nice job with this one as well. I'm a big fan of Izuku standing up for himself, so getting the opportunity to see Izuku do it not only once with the other students, especially the Gen Ed kids, but also explaining himself to All Might in a sense as well. I think that was really well done, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions on this chapter, the first half, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.